przyjemnej podróży.
Okay, so with that incredible intro, let's get started. So we're here today to talk about human development. What is it? How does it come about? How do you measure it? What caused it? And what will the future hold for it? My name is Alexander Hammond. I'm a program manager at the Rising Tide Foundation, founder of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, and a free trade fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and also author of a book, which, not so subtle plug, you can buy upstairs, called 65 Heroes of Progress, that explores different people, many of whom who you wouldn't have heard of, who have saved or improved millions of lives and shaped the modern world. And with me, I'm joined by Dr. Marian Tupy. Marian is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He is the editor of the website humanprogress.org, which is a fantastic resource to basically look at the ways the world is getting better and explore different themes of progress. And he is also an author. One of his books is called Top 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know. And his second book, Superabundance, has been published, was it 1 or 2 years ago?
A couple of years ago.
But just 3 weeks ago, it's been released in Polish. And our friends at the Economic Freedom Foundation actually have a very special gift that anyone attending this event can pick up a free copy. And of course, nothing is free, but I should say unpriced copy of Superabundance in Polish. And to do so just at the end, they're being handed out now if you would like a copy. Fantastic book, and I definitely recommend it. So Marian, let's get started. You are Slovakian, and yet you're optimistic, and you've devoted your career to studying the ways the world is getting better, and your website humanprogress.org relentlessly, day after day, shows us how the world is getting better. So what ways is the world improving? Because when you pick up a newspaper, you talk to most people, I'd say especially in Slovakia and Poland, everyone is very gloomy often about the future. So how is the world actually getting better?
Well, first thing to recognize is don't look at the headlines, look at the trend lines. Look how the world is changing over long periods of time. We can measure it. We have indicators of human well-being. And when you take those into account, what you realize is that there are many more things which are getting better than things which are getting worse. Let's start with the most important one, which is longevity. Throughout our history as a species on this planet, 300,000 years, the average life expectancy was 30. Today, it is 72 globally. It is 76 in Poland, it is 79 in the United States, and it is over 80 in places like Japan. So in the last 200 years, we were able to add one additional lifetime to the lives before. Let's talk about child mortality. Child mortality, which is to say children between 0 and 15, was 50%. So if you look at this room, think about 50% of people, every second person disappearing, and you get a sense of what it was like. We can also talk about famines that, again, for most of our history, people were going hungry. Famines, which is to say massive death due to lack of food, and we were always separated only by one harvest from a famine. If a harvest went bad, people just died. Famines have basically disappeared from the world, except for war zones, places like Yemen, a few years ago. Right now, throughout the world, countries produce enough calories to feed everybody, and we can feed even more people, many more people than we currently are, because our agriculture has become so much more productive. But I don't just want to talk about material improvements. We can also talk about moral improvements. The fact that women are equal citizens to men now, as opposed to 200 years ago when they weren't. We can talk about gays and lesbians, who in many countries have equal rights than previously. We can talk about people of color, etc., etc. So it's not just that materially we are better off, but we have also become much more moral. We care about each other, we care about the environment, we don't pollute and don't litter as much as we used to. We even care more about animals. So there are many, many dimensions along which life today is better than it has ever been.
So would you say you are just a naturally optimistic person, or have you become one as a result of your experience, perhaps growing up? Where has this come from? Or do you not see yourself as necessarily naturally optimistic and it's just become as a result of looking at this data?
That's right. I don't think about my work as spreading optimism. I think about my work as spreading realism, which is to say that if you know what the realistic picture of the world is much better than people assume, because people are obviously imprisoned by the headlines, by the terrible things that they see in the newspapers. But underneath it, progress is continuing incrementally and in many ways consistently. So. But I mean, here we are in Poland, right? When I was a kid in Czechoslovakia, Poland was a joke. Not just in Western world. It was a joke behind the Iron Curtain, because Poland was associated with poverty and hyperinflation. Well, nobody's laughing anymore. Poland has had GDP growth of roughly 4% on average over the last 30 years. Within the next 10 to 15 years, if the current trend line continues, then Poland will catch up with the United Kingdom, and that is something that nobody could have perceived. If you told the Poles back in 1989, when communism was collapsing here, that one day they'd be as rich as the Brits, they would consider you a madman. So there's just a lot of stuff that shows you the world is improving, and consequently I don't consider myself really an optimist. It's like just the reality is much better.
Yeah, and in Poland, if I was looking yesterday, if current GDP per capita trends continue, or GDP growth continues, it's about 3.6% in the last decade growth per year. So that means in about 18 years or so, the economy will double yet again, which is pretty impressive.
May I make one point? And that is that Poland already is a rich country compared to the rest of the world. It is not as rich as Germany, it is not as rich as Britain or France, but Polish GDP per capita adjusted for PPP, purchasing power parity, is about $44,000. And the median in the world is about $16,000. So the Poles are already 3 times as rich as the people at the median. Yeah.
So, given this, so we've established progress is happening across a range of different metrics. Why then are people so pessimistic about the state of the world? YouGov often does, or I guess infrequently does, polls looking at people's perceptions on if the world is improving or not. And generally, most people, especially in the Western world, say they believe the world is getting worse and not the best place to live. Studies, and I saw a recent one done in America where about 1/3 of people say they feel anxious half or like most of the time. And that goes up to about 50% for young people. So despite the data we have, the world we live in, this building used to be this old Soviet power plant, and now look at it, it's beautiful. Why are we so pessimistic?
Well, part of it has to do with human psychology. The human brain has evolved to be pessimistic, essentially. Optimists got weeded out of the gene pool, right? And this can show, I mean, let's say that you hear rustling behind a bush, and it could be a tiger that is going to eat you. The overreaction to possible threat that you run away, is much less costly in terms of genetics than underreaction to a potential threat. You know, you say to yourself, okay, everything is fine, I'm just going to go there, and you know, you get eaten. So consequently, you would expect us to sort of natural selection to produce people who are pessimistic. And in fact, we know from psychological research that humans have a lot of negativity biases. One negativity bias is that bad is always stronger than good. So we fear losses much more than we appreciate gains. Another one is that we cannot perceive incremental changes. So incrementally, Poland over the last 30 years, every year has been slightly better off, right? But there was never any particular day during which, you know, suddenly the GDP per capita doubled. It didn't happen that way, it just happened incrementally. Whereas bad things happen instantaneously, you know, when a war breaks out, for example. You know, speaking of war, the nature of the news basically is one that plays into the negativity biases. There is no news in saying today, just like yesterday, just like day before yesterday, our GDP per capita has improved by 0.03%, or life expectancy by 0.1%. No, that never happens. News is the change from the status quo. So when something goes wrong, that's when you get the news item, not when things are sort of progressing fine. And I would also say, finally, that it's a competition within the media. You know, it's kind of a strange thing to say for a free marketer, but the reality is that the newspapers today, they don't just have to compete against each other, they compete against TV and radio and, of course, against the internet. And so, because we know that the human mind, the human mind gravitates toward bad news. If it bleeds, it leads. Everybody has an incentive to produce as horrific headlines as possible, because that's how you sell more newspapers, right? In fact, there is research showing that every additional negative term in a headline of an article increases the click-through rate by 2%. So it's human psychology.
And wasn't there a study as well, you might know the university, where they tracked people's eye movements on good headlines versus bad headlines? And even amongst those people who said they preferred reading about good news, even amongst those people, their eyes always spent like the vast majority of their time reading the negative stories, just in case. Yeah,
I think that was a Harvard study. Another Harvard study showed that that when humans overcome a problem, that becomes the new baseline. But we continue to look for problems, even if they are minor. We constantly need to have those problems to complain about. So, for example, if you take the United States, we had a serious problem for many decades, indeed centuries, with overt racism. People didn't have the same rights as others, or for that matter, with misogyny and the fact that women didn't have the same rights. So we have fixed that. But that doesn't. But the human brain still needs to look out for something problematic. So now we are talking about microaggressions, right? If you ask somebody, where are you from in the United States, they assume that it's a microaggression because you don't consider them to be one of your own. If you open door for a woman who happens to be a, you know, third or fourth generation feminist, you know, she might get offended for doing that. So big problems we have solved. Now we are dealing with microaggressions.
And I guess in one's personal life as well, you can, I'm sure we all have examples of over years of us striving towards achieving what we perceived at the time to be a really big goal. And then once we achieve said goal, we then look back and think, oh yeah, I mean, it was good that I did said thing. It could be even as simple as going to university and I've got 4 years to graduate and it seems so far away, such a big goal. But then when you look back, you're like, oh yeah, I of course, it doesn't seem as big in retrospect than it did during the time. So I think a good place to go here is to talk about briefly, before we move on to some perhaps contemporary issues and maybe the problems of progress, is what caused this? So in the last 200 years, you know, extreme poverty, if you define it as $1.90 per person per day, has declined from about 86% of a population to about 8% of a, 94% of a population to about 8% of a population. And as you said, with life expectancy more than doubled, infant mortality has dropped significantly. What actually caused this change across many parts of the world?
So, in my interpretation, all human progress happens because of new ideas. A movement from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy is a new idea. It is an innovation. A movement from Aristotelian physics to Newtonian physics, that's an innovation. A movement from understanding medicine through a humoral perspective to one based on germ theory of disease, that's progress. That's innovation, that's a new idea. So it depends on ideas, new ideas that humans have, and that new idea gets then translated into invention, which then gets evaluated in the marketplace of ideas until you end up with an actually applicable working innovation that produces better results for society. And we have always innovated. But innovation was incredibly haphazard and slow. So, for example, the original stone tools are about 2.5 million years old, and they are very primitive. But then you get more refined stone tools, but they only come 1 million years later, in 1.5 million years ago. And then you have to wait for another 1 million years until you get to the first metal age, which is copper age. So it was incredibly slow. The big question really is why, in the last 200 years, we have given birth to this concept called modernity. We are moderns as opposed to ancients. We live in a period called modernity, and this is really characterized by sustained and rapid innovation. So we have rapid innovation, doesn't happen every million years, it now happens on a daily basis. And it's also sustained. So there aren't huge gaps between, there's constant innovation. And in my interpretation, really, it's the spread of human freedom. Human freedom understood both politically and also economically. 200 or 300 or 400 years ago, you couldn't really do business as we now understand it. If you want to, I don't know, make shoes, you can just open a shop and start making shoes. But in the old days, you would have to be a member of a guild, and you would have to be apprenticed for a long time, and then maybe you became a member of the guild. But this was meant to keep competition down. Similar vein. In the old days, you would have a monopoly on trade. So maybe Alex, you would be given monopoly to export wool to Spain, and Marian would be given a monopoly on the importation of French wine to Britain. The point is that trade wasn't free. And then we come to political freedom, such as, for example, the freedom to speak, right? That certainly wasn't the case 500 years ago in Europe, when speech was heavily controlled, books would be burned, and all of that changed. We became much more tolerant of new ideas. We become much more tolerant of innovation. Deirdre McCloskey has a trilogy of books on innovation. I think that's a very important development that happened in Europe, because innovation was always seen as something bad. In the first history book ever produced by human brain, Herodotus' History, he talks about Cyrus the Great, who was betrayed by one of his vassals. And Cyrus says, "The vassal has done me an innovation." Okay, so innovation was actually associated with treachery, with something undesirable. Whereas today, we welcome innovation and we revel in it.
Yes, and of course, to be innovative is to create something new, which then also goes against the status quo, which if you're a king or a guild or any sort of entrenched interest and you have power, you can stop that fairly easy. You pointed out something very important. Joel Mokyr, an economic historian from Northwestern University, likes to say that every innovation is an act of rebellion against the status quo. It can be political status quo, if you're trying to produce democracy from tyranny. It can be an economic status quo, such as free trade. It can be a religious status quo, such as differing interpretation of the Bible. The point is that every innovator has to struggle. He is rebelling against the status quo. And if the status quo power, be it
priests or politicians or military leaders or oligarchs, if they have enough power to squash innovation, they will do so.
Okay, so I think one thing that's come up a lot during this conference is the issue of climate change and other risks that we as a species face. When both of us speak about progress, one of the main questions is usually along the lines of, all this progress usually involves burning huge amounts of fossil fuels, destroying the environment, creating worse outcomes for ourselves and our future generations, destroying the planet at the expense of economic growth. I think we've all heard that quite a lot. What would you say to that? If progress is continuing, we're beginning to get richer, what about the planet?
Well, if there was a lot of talk about climate change here in Poland, that means that Poland is a wealthy country. Because poor people don't care about the climate, they don't care about environment, the rich people do. This is called the so-called the Kuznets curve of environment. Essentially, when you start industrializing, you do a lot of damage to the environment, then you become wealthy and suddenly you start caring about the environment and you start spending money on it. The big question is whether, but there are trade-offs, right? If you, for example, increase the price of electricity or energy in Poland to the levels of Germany and France and Britain, then you are beginning to have a negative impact on economic growth. And let's face it, in every nation there are people who could do with more economic development, who could do with a little bit more money. The fact that Poland is now a rich country doesn't mean that everybody is rich. And it also doesn't mean for human beings that we are rich enough. Because if we stop developing, we are dead in the long run. There is going to be a problem that is going to face humanity and the planet that we cannot foresee. It could be, I don't know, sun rays, it could be gamma rays, it could be the reversal of magnetic field, whatever. There will be these problems, and a technologically primitive society and a poor society is not able to deal with these kinds of problems rather than technologically sophisticated and rich society. When that kind of existential problem comes, such as blowing asteroids out of the sky, you want to be a rich and sophisticated society so that you can afford to do that. Had COVID, we dealt with COVID by shutting down society and paying people to stay at home because we could afford it. 200 years ago, we wouldn't be able to do that. And finally, I would say that climate change is real. Climate change happens in part because of human contribution, and it is a problem. But it is not an existential problem. The number of people who are dying due to severe weather has actually decreased by close to 99% over the last 100 years. So it's a problem, we should solve it, and we can solve it, but it is not an existential crisis. And we can solve it by, for example, innovating better sources of energy, such as using more nuclear power, maybe having fusion. We will probably end up with machines that are able to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. I would much rather spend tens of billions of dollars on research, on clean energy research, than spending hundreds of billions of dollars on windmills and solar in subsidies.
Yeah, I think you raised an interesting point, especially when you just mentioned about COVID, because sometimes people do say when talking about economic growth from a climate is, okay, we're basically rich enough. Most people in our country, almost all people in our country aren't starving. Those who are, we should definitely help, but we'd be pretty good at this level of economic growth, indefinitely. And quite a few people say that, the degrowthers, they're sometimes known as. But with COVID, you got me thinking is, when it happened, imagine if, and I think actually maybe there was an article on humanprogress.org, Marian's website, about what if COVID happened in the 1990s and we had no Zoom. We couldn't easily, we didn't have any internet. We couldn't make video calls. Phoning your relatives abroad would be cripplingly expensive for most people. So even, I guess, prosperity helps us overcome these crises.
And also, we didn't have the technology to produce the vaccine as quickly as we could. But you can extrapolate this problem into the future. So we were able to handle COVID as well as we did, and we didn't handle it very well because we were rich and because we were technologically sophisticated. But we don't know what other problem we are going to encounter in 10 or 20 years' time, or 50 years' time, or 100 years' time. And you want to sort of look at your society and say, okay, we are as good as we could have been. I mean, it would be crazy if the world ended because we were lacking an additional 5 years of economic development, if you see what I mean.
Yes. And what are the ways that innovation can help us when it comes to climate change? A few I can think of off the top of my head is, because we mentioned, and you just mentioned it, and I actually mentioned it at the grand opening, that the number of deaths related to climate, natural disasters has declined, depending on which disasters, but at least 96%, in some disasters, 99%. What technology is helping with that? So I can think of, we can track the weather, which is magic for someone 200 years ago. We know when it's going to rain. That's the thing of gods for most of human history. Better housing, I guess.
Yeah, maybe sensors at the bottom of the sea, which tell us when there is an earthquake, which is going to generate a tsunami, so that we know hours in advance that there is a huge wave coming to the coastal areas, and we can warn people to go to the higher ground. But the key really is here satellites and our ability to know exactly where the hurricane is going to go and warn people to get out of the way. That is why property is suffering a lot of damage, but we are actually not losing that many people to the hurricanes themselves.
Yes, and that just reminded me, it's also the case that sometimes the data on natural disasters, and I realized this a few years ago, can be a bit funny because for a disaster to be called a disaster, it actually has to involve there needs to be humans involved, whether it's deaths or injuries or economic damage. So the fact disasters are increasing, of course, to some degree because of climate change, but actually the fact there's 6 billion more people than there were 100 years ago means there has to be more disasters, because if a hurricane hit an empty island, then it's actually not a disaster because no one was there, no damage happened, assuming nature wasn't affected. And on the topic of population, that's another big concern some people have about the future. There's too many people causing, too much damage. Maybe society would be better if there was just 1 billion people, 2 billion people, some people say 100 million people. Are you concerned about population growth? I know Elon Musk is very big on, he's cautious of depopulation. What do you make of it?
I am concerned about depopulation because innovation and human progress depend on ideas, and only human beings can have ideas. So the fewer people you have, then fewer ideas you're going to have, which means that fewer innovations are going to happen. And look, on the current trajectory, I think the TFR, total fertility rate in Poland, is like 1.5. You need to be at 2.1 in order to keep the population stable. And throughout Central Europe and Western Europe, we are well beneath 2.1. It's not as bad as in South Korea, where it's 0.7, but eventually, if these trends continue, then obviously you're going to end up with empty Europe, right? And this is particularly concerning because innovation doesn't happen everywhere. It happens in a small subsection of countries. It happens in America, it happens in Israel, it happens in Western Europe. So if in all of these in all of these countries where they actually produce innovation, you're not going to have any people, then that's obviously a problem. I don't see humans as a now, other people say that obviously if you have more people, you're going to run out of resources. And actually, even if you have a declining population, but people are becoming richer, then you are still going to use up more resources. And that's why they advocate for degrowth, which is to say, not just staying with the current living standards, but actually reducing them. And for those people who are concerned about population resources, I've written this book. So.
And I think I'll have two more questions before we turn it over to the audience. And the first one is, our friends at the Economic Freedom Foundation has kindly given, I believe everyone here, a copy of Superabundance in Polish. If you don't have one, you can pick one up at the end. What is the book about, and what is the concept of time prices?
So what we are looking at is prices of commodities relative to wages over a period of 170 years. As I said, let's put it this way, let's say that you have 4 people and a pizza. Everybody is going to get a nice slice. But if you have 10 people, the slices must get smaller. If you have 100 people, the slices will be minuscule. But that assumes that the size of the pizza is constant, that it doesn't change. And what we are arguing is that through innovation, you can actually increase the size of the pizza pie so that even though you have many more people coming to dinner, their slices can actually increase. And human beings, through innovation, are able to increase their resource base extremely well. For example, we find new deposits. When the price of something goes up, you have more of a profit opportunity. Technological change, instead of drilling for oil, which became uneconomical in the United States, we now use fracking. And things like that, substitution, for example. People are concerned about lithium-ion batteries, where's all this lithium going to come from? Well, it turns out we have a lot of lithium, but even if we didn't, we can use sodium-ion batteries, which are actually even better. So why do we compare the price of commodities to wages? Is because it allows us to do cross-country and across-time comparisons. So, for example, what is a time price? If a pound of beef costs $20 and you are making $20 an hour, then you have to work 1 hour for that beef. But if in 10 years' time your wage increases to $40 an hour and the price of beef still stays the same of $20, then you are twice as well off. You are now working only 30 minutes. And once you translate everything from dollars and cents and from Polish zloty to time, then you can do very long-run analyses. You no longer have to worry about exchange rates, inflation rates, and you don't have to worry about like currencies that may be out of maybe they no longer exist, because an hour of work is the same in Poland as it is in the United States, and an hour of work today in Poland is the same as it was in 1850. So that's how you produce data sets in time prices. Basically, you are just dividing nominal price of a good. So let's say this water is 1 zloty, I don't know. And so you divide that 1 zloty by your hourly wage at the time of the purchase, and you get a time price.
Right. So that stops you having to worry about converting into currencies at different points,
and inflation
rates and
inflation, because it doesn't matter if inflation is 10% or 10 million%, you're always comparing nominal price by nominal wage.
Great. Okay, so we will turn over to audience questions in just one moment, so please think of some. And my final question is, what advice do you have for young people? Looking at any poll, and I think talking to young people about the future, there is this sense of doom and gloom. But perhaps it's part of being young, perhaps it's not, perhaps it's the media. What advice do you have for them?
I would say that there is no excuse for inactivity and waste of opportunities. Look, it may not feel like it to the young people today who maybe want to buy better shoes or better clothes or better car or whatever, but objectively speaking, today's young generation is the best prepared generation for challenges that has ever lived. It is the richest generation, it is the healthiest generation, it is the most highly educated generation, it is the freest generation. So given all of these opportunities, given all of these advantages, I hope that no child will look back and say, I've wasted my life, I've wasted the opportunity. You have more opportunities than any other people who have ever lived, so seize it and make something out of your lives. That's my advice.
Very good. So do we have any questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Christian Sulep, Institute for Economic Studies Europe. I would like to know if, given the number of times that young people come up with very stupid ideas of things to be worried about, should we restrict their freedom of speech when they protest against things that don't make a lot of sense? What is your view of how we might tackle this issue where they are interested, they are doing something, but often it's misguided?
Well, I wouldn't restrict their freedom. I'd be quite open to increasing the voting age to 25 or 30 years. But the saving grace is, of course, that young people don't vote. Certainly not in the United States. Older people vote, and they're full of bad ideas too. Which is why we are in such a fiscal mess in the United States. The economy is growing fine, but we have huge debts and deficits. So I don't think that stupidity is a domain of the young. Plenty of older voters vote for idiotic policies. But it does worry me that it does worry me. Okay, so once again, I was born south of the border here. I spent my first 15 years of my life in Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. And what I love about my generation is that we have learned all we needed to learn about communism, and we will never be socialists, ever, right? We were of that perfect age. We had just enough taste of socialism that we will never be tempted to be socialistic. And what concerns me is that so many young people, certainly in my former homeland and elsewhere, have forgotten these lessons and are now turning sort of, center-left, and they worry about income inequality, they worry about environment a lot. And what I think they should be worried about is really economic growth. Because economic growth, if your economy is growing, like the Polish economy is growing, you can take care of the environment, and even people at the very bottom are going to get rich. And that's what's important to me.
And you mentioned you growing up in Czechoslovakia, in Slovakia. Can you just mention briefly about your childhood? What was it like? When did you move? And what happened in the country you moved to?
Well, I don't think my experience was probably all that different from experience of Polish people in their 40s in this audience, which is to say that we lived in an open-air prison. You never expected to leave and be able to travel anywhere. I mean, in Poland, it was exacerbated by the fact that it was actually a communist military dictatorship, whereas Czechoslovakia was just under Soviet military occupation. But you never sort of thought that you'll be able to see the world, to be able to travel, and so forth. And of course, we were generally poor, and it was quite dehumanizing. It was sort of belittling to know that just across the border in Austria or just across the border in Germany, people are living lives that are twice, 3, 4 times better than ours. Also, another thing which I really hated was the power of the bureaucrats. That anything you wanted to solve in your homeland, you had to bribe somebody. You had to really kiss ass, as we say in the United States. So I'm generally, I would say the biggest impact that socialism had on me, aside from the fact that I don't ever want to live in a socialist country again, is a profound and deep distaste for bureaucracy.
Yes, Adam.
Thank you so much. I love the optimism of the conversation, and as you outlined, the trajectory globally is right. But we can always do better. So if there would be one single policy, either implemented globally or here in Europe, what would that biggest single policy be that could make the change, the positive trajectory, even faster?
Oh, Europe is not difficult. It's energy. Energy consumption is falling. It's very expensive, and energy goes into everything. It's the lifeblood of the economy. If Europe continues on this path, then it's going to completely deindustrialize. Living standards are flatlining. In Britain, 20 years of no change. Italy, 20 years of no change. And a major chunk of that is because energy has become simply so expensive. And that's not because the world doesn't have energy or because we don't know how to make energy. We have made a choice to become energy poor.
I see we've got a question at the back, and then we'll come to you after, Chelsea, if that's okay.
We have a youth.
Yes, trying to.
One of those.
Did I convince you to take charge of your life and achieve great things?
I've already been convinced, but thank you for further reinvigorating that. So thank you so much for this. So I wanted to ask you, and that ties into what you're talking about with energy, that it seems like the richer a country becomes, the more willing it becomes to hamstring itself with over-regulation and actively pursuing technological choices, pathways that clearly have no positive end to them, like with Energiewende in Germany, like with NEPA regulations that were potentially well-intentioned 50 years ago, but now are becoming just a joke that keeps on keeping us behind rather than advancing. Do you see that we are perhaps with the YIMBY movement and the regulation permitting reform asks that we are maybe reaching a tipping point where that is finally going to go down? Are we going to still see more and more of that until we, as you're saying, flatline and purposefully destroy our economies in the process?
Well, that depends on how much of a believer you are in this new religion. I mean, traditional religion is disappearing, but it is being replaced by the green religion, which apparently, and it's irrational. This is completely irrational. What the Germans have done, shutting down their nuclear power stations, so now that they can burn lignite, the worst kind of coal, that shows you that you are not dealing with rational people. You are dealing with religious fanatics. And so the rationalists among us, the rational humanists, must push against that and explain what's going on and hope for the best. And sure, there are a lot of places where, even at a governmental level, people realize that there is a problem. In the United States, even in California, we now have YIMBY movements. Yes, in my backyard. Energy prices in the United States, for reasons I can't quite understand, petrol or gas, depending on how you want to call it, and election results are very highly correlated. It means that if the price of gasoline goes up, whoever is in charge is probably going to go down. And Americans, for some reason, are much more devoted to their high standards of living, and they are not prepared to sacrifice it for other reasons. Whereas that's not the case in Western Europe, it seems to me, that the extreme greens. By the way, I need to emphasize this, very important. I'm an environmentalist, in a sense that I try to minimize my negative impact on the planet. I really believe in environmental conservation, but I'm not an extreme environmentalist who basically sees human beings as a cancer on the planet. That's the key. And returning back to the rational type of environmentalism, where you try to balance humans and nature, rather than seeing human beings as something that needs to be eliminated, destroyed, is very important. And again, let me give you an example. If you can have an agriculture, okay, how about this? If every farmer in the world became as productive as the American farmer is today, we would be able to feed 10 billion people and return the landmass the size of India back to nature. If you're concerned about nature, what you want is to take people out of nature, because we are the greatest disruptor of natural processes. We're already doing quite a good job through urbanization. By 2100, 80% of people will be in urban areas. But we can limit our impact in agricultural areas, arable land, by basically becoming more productive. If instead of 40 bushels of wheat, you can now produce 200 bushels of wheat per acre, that means that you can take a lot of land, give it back to the animals and to plants so that biosphere is protected, so that biosphere can flourish. But again, the answer to these issues, these problems, is economic growth, not regulation.
And I think to touch on your earlier point about the environmental Kuznets curve, which is the idea that GDP per capita and environmental degradation increases in tandem up until a certain point. And then once that point is reached and a country is not necessarily wealthy, but just not poor enough to have to every person depend on their natural environment to survive, things look a lot better. And just to give you like a practical example, it would be, for example, if to feed my family, it depended on me. We were just in the bush, I had no job, and I had to chop down that tree to provide shelter or kill that endangered animal to provide food for them. Well, I'm going to unfortunately kill that endangered animal to provide for my family, and I think most people would. But once you're rich enough, say, a certain level of GDP per capita, supermarkets start appearing, or maybe you're, there's other markets, not even supermarkets. And that's happened with deforestation as well. In North America, in Europe, and increasingly so in Asia, the number of forest area is increasing drastically as they become richer. North America and Europe for quite a while, Asia only just. And the only places where deforestation is really happening is actually in South America and Africa. Africa, deforestation continues to increase. South America, it's happening, but the rate is increasingly slowing down. And same is true, range of things. It could be river pollution. 200 years ago, the dirtiest rivers were all in Europe. Then about 100 years ago, it was a lot of North America. Then it moved on to Asia. And now it's in the spot between most polluted rivers being some in Asia, some in Africa. I bet you in another 50 years, it will be virtually none in Asia and all in Africa. And it's just, we're increasingly improving in that way.
95% of all plastic in the oceans comes from Africa and Asia. So that gives you a sense that if you are an economically developed country, or Europe for that matter, you just pollute less, and that's a fact.
And in the UK, at least, in the last 100 years, our forest area has increased by about 2.5 times. And it's at the levels of the Doomsday Book, which was, around 1070-ish, so over 1,000 years ago. So, Chelsea. So just here.
Thank you both for this conversation. In addition to this translated book, both of you are actually listed as authors on some other books available for sale in the lobby. Alex Hammond authored Heroes of Progress, and Marian Tupy is co-author of 10 Global Trends. Could you both briefly tell us a little bit about those books and how they relate to this big picture idea of human progress?
Well, that was a free plug. We didn't pay her for that. My book, Heroes of Progress, 65 people who changed the world, and thank you for asking. It's about 65 individuals, innovators, from the last 500-600 years, who did something that fundamentally saved or improved millions of lives. It could be someone like Norman Borlaug, whose new wheat variant saved about 1 billion people in India and South America from famine. So he saved 1 billion people. It could be people like Carl Bosch and Fritz Haber, who created synthetic fertilizer about 115 years ago in Germany. And again, they saved 1 billion people. Yet you ask most people who Fritz Haber is, and they'll have no idea. And of course, he actually went on to do some awful things. And we don't need to get into that now, because being a hero of progress is not an endorsement of all aspects of their lives. It's merely an acknowledgement they did something that fundamentally shaped humanity, and that most people don't know about them. So the underlying theme throughout the book is not only biographies of these people, but actually what are the conditions and the societal conditions that they were in, and their background that led to them being able to innovate and create the world we live in today. And top 10 global trends.
Yes, so this book is full of words, and but 10 Global Trends is just full of charts. It's a chart-heavy book. We try to look at as many long-term trends as possible. Some of them I talked about today, and so it's a book of charts, really, showing all the 78 different trends in which the world is improving.
And it's a beautiful coffee table style book where you can just have, you don't need to flick through page by page, you can just kind of pick it up and be amazed.
Yeah, I mean, it was intended to lie on a coffee table so that, you know, when you are fixing drinks or dinner for somebody, you know, your guests can flip through it and suddenly you have a conversation starter. Did you know that, you know, so.
Okay, yes, please, we'll come here. I'm into Marek after. Oh, sorry.
Do you have a question?
Okay, you go and then you go and then Marek, okay.
I keep thinking about your comment about US and Israel being ahead of everyone else on the innovation journey. What do we miss, you believe, in Europe to be able to catch up?
Well, the first thing you need to do is to get rid of the precautionary principle. I mean, Europe has, I mean, it's legally, you are legally obliged to prove that the technology that you have developed will never cause any harm to anyone before you can implement it. That's insane. You know, I don't know. I mean, I could whack you over the head with this bottle and cause you harm. Does it mean that we shouldn't have bottles? You know, if the Stone Age man had the European Union, he wouldn't be able to develop a club for killing animals, you know, because he could also use it to kill his spouse. So it's insane, and you can see it in GDP per capita outcomes. I mean, Europe was catching up with the United States very quickly in the 80s and into the 90s. There was a famous chart in Financial Times, what, 2 months ago, showing that in 2000, European and American economies were basically the same size. Now, America is, what, 50% larger? Thereabouts. So that's because we have innovation. We also have 50 laboratories of public policy. We have different states who have different regulatory environments. Very often, but the bottom line is that we just regulate less, and we also don't have this precautionary principle, which is, I think, part of the reason what holds Europe back.
Great, and yes, please, sir.
Okay, thank you. My name's David Sarek. Really appreciate your work. A lot of it's echoed in my own writings as well. So perhaps if I could just put what you're fighting against into perspective here, because you're in a world where the academics, particularly American academics, are going to the extreme left. You've got people saying you can't have capitalism and fight climate change. You have to stop capitalism now. You've got anyone who disagrees with them gets kicked out of the academe, basically, today. You've got this left-wing media which is not giving any options to open debate about future for progress and progressive thinking. You've got NGOs now basically dictating policies, and you have, for example, the precautionary principle is a good example being used now by policymakers. If you take a look at the Green Deal, you mentioned about energy, farm to fork is another thing that, you know, is going to destroy European progress for the future. So my question, I guess, comes down to basically this. Aren't you frustrated?
No, because I see progress everywhere. I mean, the world may not be moving as fast as I would want it to move, but this country is better off. Even Slovakia is better off than it was in 1989, in spite of the best attempts of our governments of my homeland to prevent that from happening. This issue is not just a problem of the left. Yes, left has always been much more skeptical about free markets and about economic growth, or maybe not always. Like Jack Kennedy was very much a free market guy. His tax break was one of the largest in American history. But certainly since the 1970s onwards, the left has become much more anti-market. Now, the great innovation of Donald Trump was to take over he's a lifelong Democrat, to take over the Republican Party and turn it into an anti-free market party. So when you sort of think at a meta level about Democrats, they always were a party of sort of perpetual victims, right? The free market is destroying us, it's making rich people richer and poor people poorer, it's destroying the environment, etc. And the Republican Party, certainly during Reagan and Bush, was more a party of, well, you know, you should, you know, we are hardworking people, and if there's competition, we are just going to compete with the rest of the world, and we are going to win. That's no longer the case. That's not the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan. Now you have Bush, who basically turned the Republican Party into a party of victims, just like the Democrats. So wherever the Republicans go, it's now all about protect me from Polish imports, you know, protect me from innovation and job losses. So Trump says these incredible things. Well, you know, you know what I mean. But there's this impression that America has lost millions of jobs due to our trade with China. No, 85% of all jobs lost in the United States are lost to innovation, to automatization. And that's what you want to do. You want to automatize as many jobs as possible, because instead of paying a human being to, you know, at a very high cost, you want to have a machine do it at a cost that is close to zero. The reason why everything is much cheaper than it used to be is because the machines are performing many of the tasks that human beings used to. And humans found jobs somewhere else. But automatization is the key to lowering the price of everything. And basically now, and that is also what changes jobs, eliminates some and creates others, right? The fact that we no longer have typewriters doesn't mean that all those secretaries are now unemployed. No, just people just write their own stuff on their notebooks. So anyway, the bottom line is both parties have turned away from the market, from competition, and that is the great innovation of Donald Trump.
So if I put a gun to your head and forced you to guess who will be elected next month, I know you're not speaking on behalf of any employer here, and purely your own thoughts on, and I know you want neither of them, but if I had to force you to pick, which is the American public going to choose? So
I don't want either of them, and I'm not going to vote because I live in Washington, D.C., and our city is going to go 96% for Harris. It's such a Democrat city that when Ronald Reagan won his great landslide in 1984 and lost every state, won every state in the United States except for Minnesota. In Washington, D.C., he only got 25% of the vote, so you know which way it's going. Anyway, who is going to win? I think it's going to be Trump, simply because the polls are so incredibly tight. Both Clinton and Biden led him by much larger percentages, higher percentages at this stage of the election. So if it continues to be tight, that means that he's in the lead.
Great. And Marek, for the final question.
Hello, Marek Tatawa, Economic Freedom Foundation. We had some discussions here about the future of the European Union's economy, the single market. And when I give this free market vision of Europe with less barriers at the single market, with more open borders for trade, then the response of the other side is often, but look at the United States, they have Inflation Reduction Act. Look at China, they have subsidies. So we should compete in subsidies, in protectionism, respond with the same policies. What will be your response to this type of arguments that we hear here when we try to defend more freer European Union's economy?
Well, I mean,
in 1 minute.
If you see a man blowing his brains out, then why are you really tempted to do the same to yourself? I mean, we are burning through a lot of money. The United States is in a very advantageous position whereby we can borrow a lot of money from the rest of the world at ridiculously cheap rates because the world likes to keep dollar. We pay with dollar, it's an international currency. But if the United States didn't have the US dollar, if it had a currency like anybody else, we wouldn't be able to borrow as much as we do. Currently, we are adding $1 trillion to our national debt every 100 days. It's completely unsustainable. And this is where the money is coming from, right? But we are burning through it. A lot of this money is just going to be wasted without adding very much to growth. There's this Keynesian obsession that if you spend $1, the multiplier should lead you to making 2, 3, 4% or $4. Now, the key to understanding why this cannot work is because of our experience of living in socialist countries. It's the same concept. Under socialism, capital was allocated by bureaucrats, which is why our economic growth was much lower than in countries where it's the private sector that determines where capital is going to flow. The United States is doing exactly that right now. It is allowing bureaucrats to determine how capital should be spent. And so, obviously, based on all the historical evidence we have, it cannot be as productive as leaving it to the private sector.
Okay, so I'm afraid that's all the time for questions we have. Just two quick things. The first is a huge thank you to our friends at the Economic Forum Foundation for translating the book into Polish. And as I said before, please pick up a copy if you don't already have one. And secondly, at 6 p.m. in this room, the fantastic organization Epicenter has a panel on the free market solutions to healthcare. And if you are attending the panel, there are free drinks out there now. Okay, and with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Marian Tupy.
Thank you very much.
Jedzą kanapki z kawiorem.
Nadzwyczajna kasa.
Obrażanie dziennikarz telewizji polskiej.
Chodzi o działania polityczne.
Przygotowanie ofiar dla pedofilów.
Für Deutschland.
TVP Info. Włącz się na nowo.
Radość, nadzieja, życie, wyzwanie, pasja, pamięć, zaufanie, pokój, jedność. Słowa tworzą świat. Polskie Radio. Źródło wiarygodnych informacji.
Plany biznesowe powstają z marzeń. Dlatego nie ma dwóch takich samych firm. Jedni chcą działać na całym świecie. Innym cały świat mieści się w dłoni. Sukces biznesu to nie tylko jego wielkość, ale też szczęście, jakie przynosi ludziom. PKO Bank Polski.
Uwielbiam szycie w sieci. Wczoraj podszyłem się pod wnuczka, wieczorem uszyłem intrygę na apce randkowej, a dziś planuję grubymi nićmi szyte oszustwo z promocją. Tak się szyje.
Na oszustów są sposoby. Zapoznaj się z poradami ekspertów na niedajsiepodszyć.pl.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihrer Ausreise
Polskie Radio.
Jedynka.
Rodzina spółek Pelion to 12 000 osób pracujących w ponad 300 spółkach w Polsce, Szwecji, Wielkiej Brytanii i na Litwie. Jesteśmy liderem w branży ochrony zdrowia. Od 1990 roku dbamy o długość i jakość życia. Pracować z nami możesz w jednym z 7 obszarów.
Zapraszamy do Trójki. Od nowa.
Trójka. Program Trzeci Polskiego Radia.
Czy wytrzymasz klockowe tortury ze stoickim spokojem? Czy w twardych negocjacjach zachowasz zimną krew? Czy poddasz się dobrowolnej eksmisji ze swojego łóżka? Brawo! Test na obecność serca zaliczony. To znaczy, że ty też możesz być rodzicem zastępczym. Dowiedz się jak na testserca.pl.